By the time we get to Verdi, there are really only two contralto roles, Azucena and Ulrica. In Puccini, there are none. In the men's voices, at the time we get to Verdi, we have invented a new kind of baritone, a very high baritone, really a sort of tenor. The old baritone is relegated to singing the lowest part, calling him a bass, which he isn't, but the basso profundo really is not used at all. I believe that in our current repertory, the only basso profundo part we have is the part of Sarastro, or Osmin, let's say. But anyway, it's in Mozart. The basso profundo is abandoned. So we see in the 19th century high note mania and only the higher voice being used because, of course, the high notes of a bass aren't thrilling the way the high notes of a tenor are. So the technique and the tenor voice is really invented in the 19th century because it retails these thrilling high notes to the audience, which the audience comes to love. I mentioned Traviata. Here's another concept we'll just throw in. La Traviata is, in a funny way, the first bulletproof opera that was ever written. Bulletproof, that means, for instance, when Violetta sings Sempre Libera, there are a bunch of trills on the low G. Sempre libera de G, oh, trill. Well, if the woman can't sing the trill, it doesn't matter. Verdi's put the trill in the violins, which otherwise don't play anything, just that trill. That's what I mean by bulletproof. He wants you to hear a trill. He has no idea who's going to sing the music in the theater, and so he's going to make sure you're going to hear it. This is something new. It has to do with the publishing of operas. It has to do with the gradual shift that has taken place from the, let's call it the Broadway situation, where the composer writes the music for the cast, supervises the rehearsals, and is present at the first performances, to the situation that Verdi found, which was he hoped to publish the score of an opera and have it performed all over the world by people he'd never met and in theaters he didn't even know that existed. Is an amusing point. The oldest bulletproof piece of music that I ever know, and mind you, it takes a very great man of the theater to know how to write a piece of bulletproof music. The oldest one I know is Handel's Messiah. Why that? Well, Handel was on his way to Dublin. The Messiah was premiered in Dublin, 1742. Handel had no idea what he was going to find in Dublin. He didn't know what the chorus was going to sound like. He didn't know if the orchestra could play. He went with a soprano, Madame Avoglio, who sang small parts in his company in London, therefore could not have been a great singer. Picked up Miss Edwards on the boat going across the channel, found Mrs. Cibber there, who hadn't performed at all in 3 years, co-opted her. He put something together like that. So obviously when writing this great and wonderful score, he had to write music that absolutely anybody could perform. Now, we've all heard the most terrible groups of chorus soloists perform the Messiah in churches and Sunday schools and what have you. It always works. That's because it's bulletproof. Now, this process has been applied to the other oratorios of Handel with disastrous results. Why? Because they're written for his singers in London, for his orchestra, for his chorus. He knew exactly what he was going to have, and the requirements are very, very demanding. Whereas in Messiah they are not. That's the mistake. It's a modern notion, as if you know one piece of music by a composer, that enables you to interpret everything they ever wrote. Indeed, we even witness today, if a singer can sing one role by a composer, that means to most people that they can sing any role that composer wrote. The Rossini tenor. What nonsense. Rossini has high tenors. Up until this time, the requirements of the voice were modified but similar to what they had been since Handel's time. The singer was expected to sing a reasonable legato. His words were expected to be understood, at least in the middle tones of his voice. He was expected to sing a reasonable trill and a certain amount, although less, but a certain amount of agility or coloratura in his singing. The tone was expected to be, above all, agreeable. With the advent of Verismo, we're talking about Andrea Chenier, Gioconda, Cavalleria Rusticana above all, something new happened. And I believe that this was a political thing that happened in Italy. I remember being told by Gabor Carelli, who was present at the recording of Cavalleria Rusticana in 1940 in La Scala with Mascagni conductor and Beniamino Gigli singing Lina Bruna Rasa. A great and wonderful record and a really good example of what Verismo singing should and ought to be. He said, Mascagni went to Gigli before they went to record the Siciliana at the beginning of the opera. He said, now look, Gigli, he said, when you sing this music, I don't want to hear the elegant covered tones of an opera singer. I want to hear a drunk Sicilian lying in a field and shouting as loud as he can to the heavens. He said, open it wide open and just sing like an untrained voice. And Gigli responded, he said, Maestro, I never did that in my life. He said, seeing it's you, I'll do it, but I'll do it once. And if you can use that take, that's the record that we'll use. But I will not repeat it, he said. Frightens me. And that is what he did, and indeed they used it. But you notice, if you listen to that record, by the end of the aria, Gigli's voice is starting to get a little unsteady under the strain. Gigli's voice never wobbled, even at his great age, but at that moment, under that strain. Well, what they wanted, you see, it's a political thing, it's a left-wing thing. The opera no longer for the princes sitting in the boxes of La Scala, the opera as a popular, a people's entertainment, and therefore not the elegant covered tones, the open shouty tones. We've seen this happen in Broadway recently. The same thing has happened again. When that happened, the Italians stopped producing singers that had long careers. The names of, for instance, the first Mimì, Cesira Ferrani, has not passed into the folklore of singing because Madame Ferrani, singing in that manner, was only able to have a career for 5 or 6 years. This was the way the Verismo singers went. At the same time, there was a group of people, a Melba, a Tetrazzini, who preserved the old way of singing. The young singers went into a terrible quandary of confusion. How to sing the modern music without wrecking your voice. The band, the greatest, the man who invented the way of doing this was, of course, Caruso, who's arguably the greatest singer of his time. Caruso managed to sing the Verismo music with the vehemence that it required, at the same time retaining the magnificent color of his voice, and he only lived to be 48 years old, but his voice certainly didn't deteriorate in the more than 20 years that he sang this music. But Caruso had an enormous voice, I'm told by those who heard him, and only a person with an exceptional voice can manage to do that. And I remember Richard Tucker telling me, of course, Caruso was a great and wonderful singer, but every tenor that followed him for the next 20 years utterly wrecked his voice trying to imitate those sounds. I think the breakdown in vocal pedagogy occurs in that time. There's a mainstream in Italy, which is basically simply telling the children to shout as loud as they can. They still do, as far as I can see. In America, it changed a little bit. It wasn't so much shouting as loud as you can as sing the highest note you can. Doesn't matter if it's pretty or not, just get it up there. And at the same time, there were people like Melba, as I said, and Tetrazzini, people who were like keeping the flame alive of the old guard. Interestingly enough, one of the great people that kept the flame of the old guard alive, of course, was Manuel Garcia, who had the great good fortune of living 101 years, and therefore being able to bring things that he learned in 1810 into the 20th century. Taught hundreds of people, many of them were the greatest stars of the century, wrote a lot of books, and produced a lot of teaching pupils who, because Garcia ended his days in London, taught in the Royal Academy of Music. His son and grandson taught there. A lot of them came to America. I'm told by people that went to Juilliard 40 years ago and 30 years ago that their teachers were pupils of Garcia's. This is all very important because, and then in Russia, the visits of Rubini and of Pauline Viardot and of Giuditta Pasta seem to have laid down a kind of a school which then remained like a fly in amber. So we can listen to the wonderful records of Ivan Kozlovsky, and hear what must resemble strongly the cooing of Rubini and Mario in the 19th century. But not in Italy. In the mainstream, the modern was what was important, and the modern meant shouting. Consequently, now let's be fair to the Italians. At the same time, we have Toti Del Monte, whose teacher Barbara Marchisio was a pupil of Rossini. So with Toti Del Monte, we have a person who's been trained in the old school. She applies the old school to the role of Madame Butterfly. So that's interesting, and indeed, that is the first great record of Madame Butterfly, and one of the greatest. That school we see passed on immediately to Renata Scotto, and from Scotto we see it, or at the same time, to Kaba Ivanska, to Licia Albanese, those women who sang these great butterflies. Albanese is a real verismo singer, but who always worked for the legato.